The Life and Legacy of Fidel Castro, a Revolutionary's Journey. Fidel Castro is a name that echoes through the halls of modern history. Known as the man who led one of the most significant revolutions of the 20th century, Castro transformed Cuba into the world's first communist state in the Western Hemisphere and played a prominent role during the Cold War. Yet, his legacy remains deeply divisive. For some, he was a liberator who fought against imperialism and promoted social equality. For others, he was an authoritarian ruler whose regime suppressed dissent and curtailed freedoms. This documentary examines the life and legacy of Fidel Castro, exploring his rise to power, governance, and impact on Cuba and the world. Through the lens of pivotal events and defining moments, we aim to uncover the complexities of the revolutionary who inspired millions and alienated many. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, in Biran, a rural community in eastern Cuba. He was the illegitimate son of Angel Castro, a wealthy Spanish landowner, and Lina Ruz, a household servant who later became Angel's wife. Castro grew up in a household marked by affluence, but remained keenly aware of the poverty and inequality surrounding him. Castro attended Jesuit schools, where he excelled academically and developed a deep sense of discipline, ambition, and leadership. These early years instilled in him a lifelong fascination with philosophy, particularly the works of Marx and Lenin, which would later form the core of his political ideology. In 1945, Castro enrolled at the University of Havana to study law. It was here that he first entered the political arena. The university was a hotbed of activism, and Castro quickly gained a reputation for being bold, outspoken, and dedicated to the cause of social justice. He became deeply critical of U.S. involvement in Latin America and the corruption of Cuban politics, particularly under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. As Batista strengthened his grip on power after seizing control through a coup in 1952, Fidel Castro and other dissidents began to call for revolution. Castro's first major act of defiance came in July 1953, when he and a group of rebels launched an armed attack on the Moncada Barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault was a failure. Many of his comrades were killed, and Castro was arrested. At his trial, however, he delivered an impassioned speech known as "History Will Absolve Me." In this speech, he detailed his revolutionary ideals and outlined a future vision for a new Cuba built on principles of equality, land reform, and sovereign independence. The trial turned Castro into a national figure, symbolizing resistance to Batista's regime. Although sentenced to 15 years in prison, Castro was released in 1955 under a general amnesty. Shortly after, he went into exile in Mexico, where he began organizing a revolutionary movement that would become known as the 26th of July movement. Key alliances were formed during this period, most notably with his brother Raúl Castro and the Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara. In December 1956, Fidel and 81 other revolutionaries returned to Cuba aboard the yacht Granma. Although met with immediate military opposition, Fidel and a small group of survivors retreated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Over the next 2 years, they waged a guerrilla war against Batista's forces while gaining the support of the rural poor and urban dissidents. By 1958, Castro's forces grew stronger, and Batista's regime began to falter. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and the revolutionary forces declared victory. Fidel Castro soon emerged as the de facto leader of the new government. Initially, Castro's government was a coalition of revolutionary factions and moderates. However, as tensions escalated, Fidel quickly solidified his control, sidelined moderate leaders, and established a one-party state. One of Castro's first actions as leader was to implement sweeping land reforms. Large estates were confiscated and redistributed to landless peasants. Foreign-owned industries, primarily American, were nationalized as part of a broader plan to reduce the country's dependence on external powers. While these reforms earned him admiration among the working class, they alienated wealthy Cubans and foreign investors, particularly the United States. His critics accused him of overhauling the nation's economy through reckless centralization and mismanagement. Castro's government also began censoring media, arresting dissidents, and eliminating opposition, leading to growing concerns about authoritarianism. Under Fidel Castro, Cuba adopted socialism as its guiding ideology. Castro himself provided uncompromising leadership, seen by his followers as a charismatic and tireless defender of Cuban sovereignty. The Castro government's accomplishments were not insignificant. Education became universal, and illiteracy rates plummeted. Similarly, healthcare was expanded and modernized, earning Cuba international acclaim for its success in providing accessible medical care to all citizens. These milestones became hallmark achievements of Castro's rule and part of his claim to legitimacy. However, these successes came at a cost. Political dissent was not tolerated. Opponents to his regime were persecuted, imprisoned, or exiled. Media was tightly controlled, and individual freedoms were curtailed. Organizations like Amnesty International frequently criticized the Cuban government for its human rights violations. This repression fueled the exodus of hundreds of thousands of Cubans, many of whom sought refuge in the United States. As Fidel consolidated power domestically, he also became a critical player on the world stage. Following his nationalization of American-owned assets in Cuba, the United States responded with economic sanctions and, eventually, a full trade embargo in 1960. This would mark the beginning of decades of hostility between the two nations. To counter U.S. isolation, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for economic and military support. In 1961, Fidel declared Cuba a socialist state and further aligned himself with the Soviet bloc. The Cold War rivalry reached a flashpoint during two key events: the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In April 1961, U.S.-backed Cuban exiles launched an invasion aimed at overthrowing Castro. The operation, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a catastrophic failure and only bolstered Castro's image as a defender of Cuban sovereignty. The following year, Cuba became a focal point of the Cuban Missile Crisis. After allowing the Soviet Union to install nuclear missiles on the island, the world came to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis ended with a negotiated withdrawal of missiles, but it cemented Cuba's role as a Cold War battleground. Despite international condemnation, Fidel Castro supported revolutionary movements beyond Cuba's borders, particularly in Africa and Latin America. His military and financial aid to Marxist movements in Angola, Mozambique, and other nations gained him recognition as a symbol of global anti-imperialism. While Castro maintained his grip on power, Cuba faced persistent economic challenges. The U.S. embargo severely restricted the island's access to goods and capital, while inefficiencies in the state-run economy led to shortages and stagnation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 dealt an even greater blow. Without Soviet subsidies, Cuba entered what Fidel called the Special Period, a time of severe economic crisis marked by energy shortages, food scarcity, and widespread poverty. In response, Castro reluctantly introduced limited market reforms, legalizing some small private businesses, expanding tourism, and opening Cuba to foreign investment. These changes offered small reprieves, but fell short of solving Cuba's growing economic woes. Fidel Castro's legacy divides opinion even today. For his admirers, he is remembered as a revolutionary hero who defied imperialism, redefined socialism, and championed education and healthcare in the face of relentless external pressure. For his critics, he remains an authoritarian leader whose policies stifled freedom and left Cuba economically stagnant. Tens of thousands of Cubans fled his rule, risking their lives to seek freedoms unavailable at home. Internationally, Castro's impact was significant. His staunch opposition to the US and his support for liberation movements positioned Cuba as a symbol of resistance for oppressed nations. Castro's speeches and policies inspired leftist movements worldwide, cementing his place as a key figure in Cold War history. By the time he stepped down in 2008 due to failing health, handing power to his brother Raúl, Fidel Castro had left an indelible mark on Cuba's modern identity. Fidel Castro was a man of contradictions. He fought for a better life for his people, yet imposed restrictions on their personal freedoms. He challenged global superpowers, but left his own country economically isolated. For history enthusiasts, Castro's story is as much about the man himself as it is about the ideas he represented. He stood as a revolutionary icon to some and a figure of oppression to others. Castro's life reminds us of the complexities of leadership and the enduring impact of revolutionary ideals on the modern world, a legacy as fascinating as it is contentious. History, it seems, will indeed continue to debate and absolve Fidel Castro.